Well, hello everyone. I wanted to go ahead and remind you before I get going this time that it's always a really good idea to have whatever books are relevant in front of you so you can look things up as I ask you to. And of course, the one of the benefits of the video lecture is you can always just pause the lecture and find whatever page number I've given you and then resume. So be sure to have Art Across Time and West in the World in front of you because I'll refer you to those books at several points during this talk. So what I'm trying to do in this video is give you an overview of ancient Egyptian culture and history. And so when we talk about ancient Egypt, at least the era of ancient Egypt that we'll be studying this week, we're talking about the period from about 3000 BCE to about 1000 BCE. So we're not going to go quite as far in time as we did with the Mesopotamians. And I'll just remind you that there is an Egyptian handout as well that's available on Canvas. Might not be a bad idea to have that printed out and in front of you as you listen to this. So this could be another time for you to pause and do that. That will help give you a kind of overview of the three major periods of ancient Egyptian history, which are the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And I'm not really interested in, you're not going to be quizzed on the exact dates of each of these kingdoms, but you need to have some general, very broad sense of time period, okay? So for instance, when it comes to the Old Kingdom, if you know that it was 3rd millennium BCE, 2000s BCE, that's really totally adequate. And in fact, on the handout, I don't even give you the specific dates because I just don't think you need to burden yourself with all of that. So what I want to do in this video is give you a broad sense of what are some of the significant things happening, what are some of the big developments happening in each of these three major periods of ancient Egyptian history. But before I do that, I want to say a brief word about geography, because geography, the topography of a place, the climate, other kinds of natural features, will often have a really dramatic effect on the culture that human beings create in that place. To a certain extent, this is not, you can take this too far, but to a certain extent, geography is destiny. I didn't say much about this when I talked about the Mesopotamians, but West in the World, I think, is pretty clear about this, about the ways in which geography shaped the Mesopotamian worldview and gave them a fairly kind of pessimistic outlook on the world because of how irregularly the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded. Egypt is going to be different. Egypt, the Nile, in contrast, is going to not only flood regularly and reliably, but it's also going to flood at just the right time to prepare the soil for the planting of crops. And a lot of historians think that the Egyptians were really a fairly optimistic people, and that at least one source of that optimism was this very congenial climate that they enjoyed there in Egypt. So let me say just two other quick things about Egyptian geography that I want you to be aware of. In addition to the regular flooding of the Nile, there were other geographical advantages that the Egyptians had that helped to, in some ways, isolate them from the rest of the world and protect them. You've got, in Egypt, you've got most people living pretty close to the Nile River. And then on the east and to the west, you've got basically uninhabitable deserts. To the south, you have the Sudan, Sudan, the Sudan, which was marshy and, again, not a terribly desirable place to live and not an easy place to attack from. And then to the north, of course, there's the Mediterranean Sea. But even there, an attack would be difficult because there were a lot of shallows in the sea just to the north of Egypt that made a naval attack quite difficult. So for a long time, Egypt is pretty well cut off from the world. Now, one of the developments I want to talk about today is how Egypt gets sort of drawn into the wider world. But because of its geography, for a long time, it had that isolation, which generally worked to its benefit, I think we can say. And the last thing I want to say about Egyptian geography is just a clarification, because it's kind of a confusing thing. Probably in both textbooks, I think, you'll see references to Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And you might very understandably assume that Upper Egypt would be northern Egypt and lower would be southern, but it's actually the opposite. Okay. The Nile, of course, flows south to north, and that tells us that the elevation is dropping as the Nile approaches the Mediterranean Sea. So southern Egypt is actually known as Upper Egypt because it is higher altitude, literally upper. And then northern Egypt is known as Lower Egypt because it is its elevation is closer to that of the sea level. So you'll see that terminology a lot, and I want you to be familiar with it. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be looking at the three main periods of ancient Egyptian history and asking what was going on, what was distinctive about that period of time. So we're going to start with the Old Kingdom. Again, Old Kingdom spanned the majority of the 3rd century, the 3rd millennium, rather, BC. What do you need to know about the Old Kingdom? Well, in many ways, it was a real high point in ancient Egyptian history. It was a time of great peace. Again, peace that was made possible by this geographical isolation I was just mentioning. Also a time of great prosperity and wealth, not, of course, for everybody, but for some. And, of course, above all, for the pharaohs. And that's the next point I want to make. The pharaohs, of course, are just Egyptian kings. Pharaoh is not the name of a person. It is the name of the Egyptian king. And the pharaohs will be, of course, very important figures all throughout ancient Egyptian history, but they really peak. They command the most power during this period of the Old Kingdom. And so much so that Egyptians were not, the pharaohs were not seen merely as mediators between gods and humanity, or representatives of the gods. This tended to be the way the Mesopotamians thought about their kings, but rather the Egyptians thought of their pharaohs as gods in human form. Most notably, pharaohs were often considered to be the god Horus in human form, Horus. And often Egyptian pharaohs would simply take that as a title. They would call themselves Horus and want to be called Horus, and so on. Now, with great power came great responsibility, and Egyptian pharaohs were not expected to rule arbitrarily, but rather were expected to uphold this principle called in the Egyptian language Ma'at. That's M-A and then apostrophe A-T. Now, I'm not going to say much about this. You'll read a little bit about it, and you'll hear a lot about it when you listen to Dr. Jackson's lecture on Egyptian religion. So I don't need to go deeply into that. I just want to point out that it was believed that even though, of course, pharaohs have this great power, and they ought to have this great power, that they had a very serious duty as well to maintain order, which is one way to translate Ma'at. I think looking at Egyptian art and architecture from this period is really going to drive home just how highly esteemed the pharaohs were during this period. So let me refer you to the statue of Khafre, which you can find in Art Across Time, pages 90 and 91. There's two different images from different angles there. And in many ways, this is a typical sculpture of a pharaoh. Egyptian art is highly conventional, which is to say that people were usually depicted in certain ways, with certain kinds of bodily positions and that sort of thing. And pharaohs, this was especially true of pharaohs. So, we often don't get a very good sense of what a pharaoh actually looked like in real life, because pharaohs were so often depicted in the same stance with the same kinds of features and that sort of thing. And if you look at that statue of Khafre, there's some interesting things going on that really kind of underline this point I was making about how the Egyptians saw their pharaohs as gods. You can see this, for instance, in the lions, which are sort of right underneath the armrests of the throne. Of course, in many cultures, not just Egyptian culture, lions are seen as symbols of royal power. So that really stresses the power. But where you see the divinity is in the falcon that's directly behind Khafre's head. You can see it in one of those angles in Art Across Time. And the falcon was a symbol of the god Horus. Okay? So you've got this fusion of the pharaoh Khafre and the falcon that represents Horus. You also have the fact that in this particular sculpture, there is no space between the body of Khafre and the throne itself. It's almost as if Khafre is fused to the throne. And I think the message here is that it doesn't really matter who the pharaoh is. What matters is the office. What matters is the role. And whoever is elevated to that role is seen as this kind of divine figure. So that's art. In the realm of architecture, we have a very vivid and impressive symbol of pharaonic power, because this is the great age of the pyramids. And the pyramids, as everybody knows, are absolutely phenomenal architectural achievements, really for any age, but especially for the ancient world. We're told that in the case of Khufu's pyramid, Khufu, by the way, is the father of Khafre, whose statue we were just discussing, that Khufu's pyramid took about 20 years to build. Gangs of about 100,000 workers at a time were working on this steadily over about 20 years. The pyramid itself covers about 13 acres. The pyramid was made up of about 2.3 million blocks of stone, each block of stone weighing over 2 tons. Just a mind-blowing achievement. But what's maybe even more amazing is when you stop and think about what the pyramids were for. And the answer is quite simple. As you'll see, pyramids were burial tombs. And they weren't burial tombs for the whole community. They were burial tombs solely for the pharaohs and their families. So to think that someone would be able to organize the construction of such labor and time-intensive projects, that really, I think, speaks to the power of the pharaoh. I mean, it's one thing to have to dream of having people make something like a pyramid for you, but these pharaohs actually did it, and I think we can only make sense of that if we keep in mind that the pharaohs were seen as, at minimum, godlike, and perhaps even as gods in their own right. The other thing, of course, that the pyramids tell us, or one other thing the pyramids tell us, and this goes back to a point I was making earlier about Egyptian optimism. Not only were these burial tombs, the pyramids meant to be burial tombs, but of course, all sorts of efforts were put into um, facilitating the pharaoh's entry into the afterlife, which was typically seen as a very enjoyable state. In ancient Mesopotamia, there's some kind of afterlife. It's nothing to look forward to. It's just sort of gloomy and boring. For the Egyptians, life after death, at least for some people in some circumstances, can be almost a kind of paradise. So the pyramids also reflect that Egyptian optimism about the afterlife. Now, we're talking about the afterlife. That brings us into the realm of religion. And the last thing I want to say about the Old Kingdom is that the Old Kingdom sees the birth of the first Egyptian writing system and one of the earliest writing systems, period, and that is hieroglyphics, which you'll be reading about. That's HIEROGLYPHICS. Yeah, hieroglyphics. This is kind of interesting because this is around the same time the Mesopotamians are creating cuneiform. But as we've seen, cuneiform, at least initially, had a very kind of practical intent. It was used for record keeping and that sort of thing. Hieroglyphics were developed for religious purposes, so that certain spells or incantations could be written on the walls of the pharaoh's tomb, so that he might have a happier, more peaceful afterlife, or something like that. The Egyptians are, this is yet another reason why the Egyptians are seen as having one of the most advanced civilizations in the ancient world, because they are right on the cutting edge of language, creating one of the first written languages, which modern people were not able to read until fairly recently, and with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. So you'll read about that in West in the world, and maybe in Art Across Time too. Okay, so that's the Old Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom, think pharaohs at the top of their game, pyramids, hieroglyphics. And again, in general, this is a golden age. This is a time of stability, of order, and of wealth, at least for some. Now we move into the Middle Kingdom. And one thing to know, you don't need to know much more than this, but one thing to know is that sandwiched between each of the kingdoms is a so-called intermediate period. And the main thing you need to know about any intermediate period is that it is a time of disorder, a time of war and violence, and everything that goes with that. So there's one of these intermediate periods between the Old and the Middle, but we come to the Middle Kingdom starting around 2060 or so, and Middle Kingdom is going to last until 1785. But I'm fine if you just want to remember first half of the second millennium BC. That's the time of the Middle Kingdom. What do you need to know about the Middle Kingdom? What is characteristic of the Middle Kingdom? I think one really important development is that the Egyptians are starting to look beyond Egypt and are beginning to create an empire that will really peak in the New Kingdom. They start by looking to the south, to Nubia, and conquer the Nubians. There's gold in Nubia, so that's of course going to enrich at least some Egyptians. There are signs of increased trade with the Fertile Crescent, so that would certainly include Mesopotamia and surrounding lands. So those are some important trends. We see, in art, we see one trend that's worth noting, I think, and that is a trend toward naturalism. I mentioned how in the Old Kingdom, the pharaohs tended to be depicted very generically, so that uh, the pharaohs tend, statues of pharaohs tend to look the same no matter who the pharaoh is supposed to be. That's beginning to change in the Middle Kingdom. And if you look at the statue of Sesostris III on Art Across Time 95, you'll see this increased naturalism. You'll see, this is like a recognizable human face, showing maybe a little bit of emotion. That's new. You don't find that in the Old Kingdom. Well, as I've already said, there's going to be another intermediate period. So the things will sort of fall apart again towards the end of the Middle Kingdom. The Nubians to the south will revolt. And there's an Asian group of people known as the Hyksos, Hyksos. They're going to come from the north and going to cause a lot of problems for the Egyptians. They invade the eastern Nile Delta. They are much better equipped, much better armed than the Egyptians. So there's going to be several centuries where the Egyptians are in pretty dire straits. But again, stability is restored. The Egyptians kind of reassert themselves, and that brings us to the last period we're going to talk about, the New Kingdom, which spans from 1570 to 1085. So, second half of the second millennium BC. You can remember that, you're golden. So, again, what is distinctive and characteristic of the New Kingdom? Well, it's going to, as I indicated a moment ago, the New Kingdom will see the apex, the epitome of Egyptian imperial power. So Egypt is becoming something that's bigger than Egypt. It's spanning out elsewhere in Africa, but also into Asia, into places like Syria. So look at the map on page 21 in West in the World, and you will see the extent of Egyptian power during the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is also the period of a couple of the most famous and significant pharaohs in all of ancient Egyptian history. I'm going to mention two. The first is Hatshepsut, Hatshepsut, Hatshepsut. You can look at an image of Hatshepsut on page 99 in Art Across Time. As you will see, the most striking thing about Hatshepsut is the fact that she is a she. Okay, so she is a female pharaoh. Not the only one ever, but I think probably the only one who was really able to gain a kind of authority and respect that was comparable to that of male pharaohs. And as you'll see, if you look at her statue, she certainly depicts herself as being male. The point, of course, not being that she's literally a male. Everybody knew that wasn't true. But I think the point is that she has all of the assets and the virtues and the abilities that any pharaoh would need to rule. And the fact that she's a woman doesn't undermine that. She supervised a number of great building projects. You might want to check out the Deir el-Bahari. This is on Art Across Time 100, so I won't spell that for you. I'll just direct you to Art Across Time, page 100. The second pharaoh from the New Kingdom that I want to mention is Akhenaten, Akhenaton. This was not his original name. This was a name that he gave himself for reasons that I will now explain. The thing that makes Akhenaten, well, there's two things that make Akhenaten really stand out, but I think above all, it's his religious reforms. Akhenaten was a rare bird in the ancient world in that he became a monotheist. He became convinced that there was only one God, and that God was named Aten, A-T-E-N, so Akhenaten, that's where his name comes from. One thing that you'll notice as we study the ancient world is that the default religious view of pretty much every ancient group of people, with one very notable exception, and that is the Israelites, that ancient people were polytheistic. It just came to them very naturally. We tend to think of monotheism as the most natural form of belief, but it's not the case in the ancient world. So he was really going way out into left field, Akhenaten that is, by promoting this form of monotheism. And it's something that's puzzled scholars to this day. What impelled him to do this? Where did he come up with this idea? Why did he think it would be a good idea to try to basically force the Egyptians to adopt his monotheistic beliefs? So when you read about him in West in the World, you'll read some of the theories that have been floated as to, how to answer these questions. Now, it needs to be said that as soon as he's dead, all the Egyptians immediately revert back to polytheism. So it's not as if this is going to be a lasting change. The Egyptians will re-embrace polytheism. The other thing that is interesting and notable about Akhenaten is the fact that he allowed both himself and his family members to be depicted in a very informal way. I talked about how rigid Egyptian artistic conventions tended to be. People were sort of impersonal. Most male figures look the same, most female figures look the same. But this is not true of Akhenaten and his family. So I would refer you to the family portrait on West in the World, page 23, where you can see Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti, Nefertiti. They're sort of sitting there with their child, and it's a family portrait. It's not depicting Akhenaten as this sort of godlike, powerful pharaoh. Quite the opposite in some ways. You'll also want to look at the bust of Nefertiti, his queen, on Art Across Time, page 104, which, of course, it's possible to know how much it really looked like the real Nefertiti. But again, what's significant, what's interesting is that it looks like a real woman, and a real woman with emotions and a personality. And this is just very different from earlier Egyptian art. Well, to bring the story to a close, once again, things begin to sort of break apart. Libyans will attack the Egyptians from the west. The Nubians will attack once again from the south. And so by the time you get to the turn of the first millennium BCE, ancient Egypt is just a shadow of her former self. Egypt will lose its political independence, and really for the remaining millennium and more, Egypt will be ruled by a succession of different empires, non-Egyptian empires, many of which you've already read about or we will read about in West in the World, the Assyrians, for instance, but also some empires we'll talk about later on in the course, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans. So after 1000, the glory days, 1000 BCE, the glory days of Egypt, of ancient Egypt, are certainly over. So I hope this overview will help as you begin your study of ancient Egypt. Have a great day.